The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the teenage girl stood at the center, her confident posture a stark contrast to the mocking smirk on the judge's face. The gavel had just struck, and Judge Harris leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think you can stand here and defend yourself? Against this court? Against me? You're what, 16? Go back to school, kid." The crowd chuckled uneasily, a mix of amusement and discomfort filling the air. But Sarah didn't flinch. She straightened her spine, her gaze never leaving the judge's. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "with all due respect, the Constitution doesn't say you need a law degree to defend yourself. It says everyone has the right to a fair trial, and I'm going to make sure I get one." The room fell silent. Even the judge seemed momentarily stunned. But before anyone could react, Sarah reached into her worn backpack and pulled out a stack of papers, waving them in the air. "These," she declared, "are legal precedents, and I've studied every one of them. Let me show you exactly why you're wrong." The courtroom erupted into gasps, but Sarah wasn't done. She flipped to a specific page and began reading aloud, her words sharp and deliberate. As she spoke, the expression on Judge Harris's face shifted from mocking amusement to wide-eyed disbelief. It was as if the world had flipped upside down. Suddenly, the judge slammed his gavel down. "Enough!" he shouted, but his voice betrayed a hint of panic. Sarah paused, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure, Your Honor? Or would you like me to explain why your objections violate procedural law?" The room froze, and all eyes turned to the judge. His face was a shade of crimson no one had ever seen before. And then it happened. The bailiff leaned in to whisper something to the judge, but Sarah caught it loud and clear. The judge muttered a single word under his breath. Impossible. What had Sarah just done? How could a teenager have the entire courtroom, and the judge, questioning everything? A month earlier, Sarah had no idea she would ever step foot inside a courtroom, let alone defend herself. She was an ordinary high school junior from Cedarville, a small town in the Midwest. She loved science, hated math, and spent her weekends volunteering at the animal shelter. Her life was as simple as it could be until the day everything fell apart. It started with her dad. He had been driving Sarah to school one frosty December morning when a police car pulled them over. The officer claimed their taillight was out, but what seemed like a routine stop turned into something far more serious. Within minutes, Sarah's dad was being arrested for a minor infraction, something about unpaid parking tickets. Sarah watched in shock as the officer handcuffed him and escorted him to the squad car. "Wait," Sarah cried, running after them. "There's got to be a mistake. This is crazy." The officer didn't listen. Neither did the judge at the preliminary hearing later that week. Sarah's dad was fined an amount they couldn't afford, and when he couldn't pay, he was sentenced to 30 days in jail. The injustice burned Sarah from the inside out. She had spent her whole life believing the system was fair, that it worked for people like her and her family. But now, staring at her dad behind bars, she wasn't so sure. And then came her own nightmare. 2 weeks later, as Sarah was still reeling from her dad's situation, she found herself in trouble. Walking home from the library one evening, she noticed 2 older boys from school arguing loudly on the sidewalk. One of them shoved the other, who stumbled and hit his head on a mailbox. Sarah froze, unsure of what to do. Before she could think, someone shouted, "Hey, stop her." She did it. To her horror, the boy who had fallen pointed at her, claiming she was the one who pushed him. A few others backed him up, though Sarah had never seen them before in her life. The police were called, and despite her protests, Sarah was arrested on the spot. Her mom couldn't afford a lawyer. The public defender assigned to her case seemed overworked and uninterested, brushing off Sarah's concerns and urging her to take a plea deal. But Sarah refused. She hadn't done anything wrong, and she wasn't about to let the system label her a criminal. So she did the unthinkable. She decided to represent herself. The first few days were brutal. Sarah spent every free moment at the library, poring over thick law books and printing out endless pages of legal documents. Her classmates thought she was crazy. Even her mom begged her to reconsider. "You're just a kid, Sarah," her mom said one night, tears streaming down her face. "You can't take on a whole court by yourself. You'll lose." But Sarah didn't see it that way. "If I don't fight," she replied, "I've already lost." By the time the trial began, Sarah had learned more about the law than she ever thought possible. She understood terms like burden of proof and due process. She knew her rights backward and forward. And most importantly, she had a plan. Still, nothing could have prepared her for the hostility she faced in court. From the moment she stood before Judge Harris, he made it clear he didn't take her seriously. He interrupted her opening statement, rolled his eyes during her cross-examinations, and openly laughed when she cited case law. But Sarah didn't let it break her. With every sneer and every mocking comment, she grew more determined. Back in the courtroom, the tension was so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Sarah held her ground as the judge glared down at her, his gavel trembling in his hand. "Do you have anything else to say, Miss Carter?" he snapped. Sarah took a deep breath. "Actually, I do, Your Honor. If you'd let me finish." And then, in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom, she delivered the words that would change everything. What she said left everyone stunned and sent the trial spiraling into chaos. The courtroom was still as Sarah leaned forward, her voice unwavering. "Your Honor, according to Gideon versus Wainwright, every person accused of a crime has the right to adequate legal representation. By undermining my efforts and refusing to take me seriously, you are violating my constitutional rights. I may not be a lawyer, but I know enough to recognize bias when I see it." A ripple of gasps spread through the room. Even the stenographer paused mid-typing, her fingers hovering over the keys. Judge Harris's face tightened, as though he'd just bitten into a lemon. "You're accusing this court of bias?" he hissed, his voice dangerously low. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied without flinching. "And if you continue this behavior, I'll have no choice but to file a motion for your recusal." The judge slammed his gavel. "Order. This is nonsense. You're out of line, Miss Carter." Sarah stood her ground. "With all due respect, Your Honor, the law doesn't bend to intimidation. If you doubt me, I'd be happy to cite the relevant statutes." Judge Harris opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the soft rustle of papers as the opposing attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The judge glared at Sarah for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a sharp inhale, he snapped, "Proceed." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had done it. She had stood up to the judge and lived to tell the tale. But the battle was far from over. The events leading up to that moment had been grueling. After deciding to represent herself, Sarah realized she had underestimated just how difficult the task would be. The legal jargon was confusing, and the pressure of preparing her defense alone was overwhelming. But giving up wasn't an option. She spent countless nights at the public library, where the elderly librarian, Mrs. Jenkins, noticed her struggle. One evening, Mrs. Jenkins approached her with a steaming cup of cocoa and a kind smile. "You've been here every night this week," she said. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" Sarah hesitated, unsure if she could trust anyone. But something about Mrs. Jenkins's gentle demeanor made her feel safe. She explained her situation, and to her surprise, the librarian didn't laugh or dismiss her. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "That's a tall order," Mrs. Jenkins said. "But if anyone can do it, I think you can. Let me show you a few resources that might help." From that night on, Mrs. Jenkins became Sarah's unofficial mentor. She taught Sarah how to navigate legal databases, how to find precedents that supported her case, and even how to organize her arguments. "Remember," Mrs. Jenkins said one night, "the truth is on your side." That's a powerful thing, but not everyone was as supportive. At school, Sarah became the target of relentless teasing. Her classmates called her Lawyer Barbie and mocked her for thinking she could win against seasoned attorneys. Even her teachers seemed skeptical. During lunch one day, Sarah overheard two boys at the next table laughing. "She's gonna crash and burn," one of them said. "Bet the judge throws her out on the first day." Sarah clenched her fists but kept her head down. Their words stung, but she refused to let them break her spirit. As the trial progressed, the pressure intensified. The opposing attorney, Mr. Blake, was a seasoned prosecutor known for his sharp wit and ruthless tactics. From the moment the trial began, He made it clear he didn't see Sarah as a threat. "Miss Carter," he said during his opening statement, "while I admire your determination, this court is no place for amateur theatrics. Let's keep this professional, shall we?" The audience chuckled, and Sarah's cheeks burned, but she refused to rise to his bait. Instead, she focused on presenting her case. Her first witness was a jogger who had been passing by when the altercation occurred. Though the jogger couldn't identify Sarah as the one who pushed the boy, he confirmed that the lighting was poor and the scene chaotic. "Would you say it was difficult to see what happened clearly?" Sarah asked. "Absolutely," the jogger replied. The prosecutor tried to discredit the witness, but Sarah remained calm, countering his objections with logical arguments. It was a small victory, but it gave her the confidence to keep going. The lows of the trial were crushing. On the third day, one of the boys who had accused Sarah took the stand. His testimony was filled with inconsistencies, but he delivered it with such confidence that it was hard to tell where the truth ended and the lies began. "Miss Carter shoved me," he said firmly. "I saw her do it." Sarah's stomach churned, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she cross-examined him, pointing out the discrepancies in his story. "If you were standing in front of the mailbox, how could you see who was behind you?" she asked. The boy hesitated, but before he could answer, Mr. Blake objected. "Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant." The judge glanced at Sarah, his expression unreadable. "Sustained. Move on, Miss Carter." Sarah gritted her teeth, but obeyed. For every step forward, it seemed like there were 2 steps back. By the 5th day of the trial, Sarah was exhausted. Her notes were a mess, and her confidence was waning. But she refused to give up. As she sat at her makeshift desk that night, reviewing her arguments for the next day, she came across a crucial piece of evidence she had overlooked: a traffic camera located near the scene of the incident. Her pulse quickened as she realized it might have captured the truth. But there was a catch. The footage hadn't been included in the evidence presented by either side. She would have to petition the court to obtain it, and there was no guarantee the judge would allow it. The next morning, Sarah stood before the court, clutching her petition. Her voice was steady as she addressed Judge Harris. "Your Honor, I've discovered the existence of a traffic camera that may have recorded the incident. I request that the footage be subpoenaed as evidence." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're asking this court to delay proceedings for a fishing expedition?" "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "I'm asking this court to seek the truth. Isn't that what we're here for?" The judge's gaze bore into hers, and for a moment, it seemed like he might deny her request. But then he sighed heavily and said, "Very well. The footage will be reviewed." Sarah felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. As the bailiff stepped out to retrieve the footage, the judge's expression darkened. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice icy, "if this turns out to be a waste of time, you'll regret it." When the footage finally arrived, everyone in the courtroom leaned forward in anticipation. The bailiff inserted the USB drive into a laptop, and the screen came to life. The grainy video showed the scene exactly as Sarah had remembered it. 2 boys arguing, one shoving the other, and Sarah standing several feet away, frozen in shock. She wasn't anywhere near them when the boy fell. A collective gasp filled the room. Sarah's accusers exchanged panicked glances, and even Mr. Blake looked stunned. Judge Harris stared at the screen, his face unreadable. Then he turned to Sarah, his eyes narrowing. "Well, Miss Carter," he said slowly, "it seems you've made your point. But this trial isn't over yet." Before Sarah could respond, the judge slammed his gavel down. Court adjourned. The room erupted in chaos, but Sarah's mind was already racing. What would the next day bring? Would the truth finally prevail, or would the system find another way to silence her? The courtroom buzzed with whispers after the shocking revelation from the traffic camera footage. Sarah sat at the defendant's table, her heart pounding. For the first time since the trial began, she felt a glimmer of hope. The video had proved her innocence, or at least shown that she wasn't the one who pushed the boy. But the judge's icy demeanor still lingered in her mind. As the bailiff escorted everyone out of the courtroom, Sarah caught snippets of conversations. "Did you see that? She was nowhere near them. This case might fall apart after that. Bet the prosecutor's fuming." Sarah's mom rushed to her side as soon as they were out in the hallway. "You did it," her mom said, tears brimming in her eyes. "That footage. How did you even think to ask for it?" "I almost didn't," Sarah admitted, her voice trembling. "But something told me to keep looking, to keep fighting." Her mom hugged her tightly, but Sarah's relief was short-lived. As they walked toward the exit, she noticed Mr. Blake talking heatedly with the judge in a corner of the hallway. Though she couldn't hear their words, the tension in their body language was unmistakable. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The weight of the trial bore down on her like a heavy blanket. She replayed the footage in her mind, over and over again, wondering what the prosecution's next move would be. The evidence was on her side now, but she knew better than to underestimate her opponent. The next morning, Sarah arrived at court early. The air was thick with anticipation as people filled the gallery, eager to see what would happen next. Mr. Blake seemed unusually calm, which only made Sarah more anxious. Once everyone was seated, Judge Harris entered the courtroom. He wasted no time, his gavel striking with authority. "Before we proceed," he began, "the court must address the new evidence presented yesterday." Sarah held her breath as the judge turned to Mr. Blake. "Does the prosecution have a response?" Mr. Blake stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, while the footage is compelling, it is not definitive. It doesn't prove Miss Carter's innocence. It only raises questions about the sequence of events." Sarah's jaw tightened. How could he still spin this against her? Furthermore, Blake continued, "I've uncovered new evidence that sheds light on Miss Carter's motives." He turned to the gallery, where a man in a sharp suit stepped forward holding a folder. "This," Blake said, holding up the folder dramatically, "is a statement from a student who claims Miss Carter had a history of conflict with the victim." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sarah's hands balled into fists under the table. "That's a lie," she shouted, unable to contain herself. "I didn't even know him." Judge Harris banged his gavel. "Miss Carter, you will remain silent until it's your turn to speak." The man in the suit handed the folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. As Judge Harris read through the statement, his expression grew more severe. "This is a serious accusation," he said, looking down at Sarah. "Do you have any explanation for this?" Sarah felt her world spinning. Who could have written such a thing? She racked her brain, trying to think of anyone who might have a reason to frame her. But no one came to mind. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her, "this so-called evidence is fabricated. I've never had any issues with the victim. In fact, I barely knew him." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And how do you intend to prove that?" "I'll cross-examine the witness," Sarah said, her resolve hardening. "If they're willing to lie about me, I'll expose it." The mysterious witness was called to the stand the next day. To Sarah's shock, it was Emily Brooks, a girl from her science class. Emily was quiet, reserved, and had never seemed the type to get involved in drama. Sarah's heart sank as Emily nervously glanced around the courtroom, refusing to meet her eyes. "Miss Brooks," Mr. Blake began, "can you tell the court about the incident you witnessed between Miss Carter and the victim?" Emily swallowed hard. "A few weeks before the accident, I saw Sarah arguing with him in the hallway. She was yelling at him, saying he needed to leave her alone." Sarah's head whipped up. "That's not true," she blurted. Judge Harris slammed his gavel. "Miss Carter, you will have your turn." Emily's hands trembled as she continued. She told him he'd regret messing with her. Gasps filled the room again. Sarah's heart raced. None of this had happened. So why was Emily lying? When it was Sarah's turn to cross-examine, she approached the witness stand, her mind racing. "Emily," she began, her voice calm but firm, "how long have we known each other?" Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Since the start of the school year. And in all that time, have I ever been anything but polite to you?" Emily hesitated. "No, you've always been nice." "Then why are you saying these things about me now?" Sarah asked, leaning closer. "Did someone ask you to say them?" Emily's face turned red. I don't know what you mean." Sarah took a deep breath, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Emily, did Mr. Blake, or anyone else, offer you anything in exchange for your testimony?" The courtroom went silent. Emily's eyes widened in panic, and she looked over at Mr. Blake, who shook his head subtly. No, Emily stammered. No one asked me to do anything. But Sarah caught the hesitation in her voice. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I believe this testimony has been influenced by outside pressure. I request a deeper investigation into how this statement was obtained. The judge rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. We'll take this under advisement. Court is adjourned until tomorrow. As Sarah left the courtroom that day, she couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was hiding something. She had seen the fear in her eyes, the way she avoided looking at Mr. Blake. But without proof, Sarah couldn't do anything, yet. That night, as Sarah reviewed her notes, she remembered something Mrs. Jenkins had told her. Always follow the trail, the librarian had said. Wherever there's a lie, there's usually something, or someone, behind it. Sarah decided to follow the trail. If Emily was lying, there had to be a reason. And Sarah was determined to find out what it was, no matter what it took. Sarah's determination hardened overnight. Emily's testimony was the turning point she hadn't anticipated, but Sarah knew it was a house of cards. Lies like that didn't stand tall without someone propping them up. As she sat at her kitchen table the next morning, reviewing every detail of Emily's statement, Sarah realized she had to take matters into her own hands. If no one else was going to expose the truth, she would. Her mom walked into the room, concern etched across her face. Sarah, you've hardly slept, she said, setting a plate of toast in front of her. You need to take care of yourself. I will, Mom, Sarah replied, forcing a weak smile. But right now, I need to figure out why Emily would lie. Her mom sat down across from her, worry flickering in her eyes. Do you think someone's forcing her? She seemed so nervous in court. I think so, Sarah said. And if I can prove it, I'll destroy the prosecution's case. At school, Sarah's classmates avoided her. She was used to the whispers and stares by now, but today was different. The tension was thicker, the judgment more intense. She overheard snippets of conversations as she walked through the hallways. She probably threatened Emily, too. Can you believe she's still trying to defend herself? I heard the footage wasn't as clear as people think. Sarah clenched her fists, ignoring the comments as best she could. But when she saw Emily sitting alone in the library during lunch, Sarah knew this was her chance. She approached cautiously, pulling out a chair across from her. Emily looked up, startled, her face pale. Can we talk? Sarah asked, keeping her voice low. I don't think that's a good idea, Emily stammered, closing the book in front of her. I'm not here to fight, Emily. I just want to know why you said those things about me. Emily glanced around, as if worried someone might be watching. I already told the court what I saw, she said, her voice shaky. Did you? Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice even more. Because I don't think you did. You seemed scared yesterday, like someone was pressuring you. Emily's hands fidgeted with the edge of her book. I can't talk about this, she whispered. You can, Sarah urged. I know you're scared, but if you're being forced to lie, you don't have to go through this alone. Please, Emily. Who's behind this? For a moment, Sarah thought Emily might open up. Her lips parted, and her eyes darted to the door. But then she shook her head. I can't, she said, her voice barely audible. You don't understand, Emily. I have to go. Emily grabbed her things and hurried out of the library before Sarah could say another word. Frustrated but not defeated, Sarah turned to her only ally outside the courtroom, Mrs. Jenkins. That evening, she walked into the library, where the elderly woman greeted her with a warm smile. Sarah, what brings you here? Shouldn't you be resting for the trial tomorrow? I need your help, Sarah said, explaining the situation with Emily. She's scared, Mrs. Jenkins. I think someone's pressuring her, but she won't tell me who. Mrs. Jenkins nodded thoughtfully. It's not uncommon for witnesses to be manipulated, especially in high-stakes cases. But finding proof won't be easy. Sarah sighed. I don't know where to start. Well, Mrs. Jenkins said, tapping her chin, if Emily's lying, there may be records of her interactions with the prosecution. Emails, messages, something to show she was coerced. How do I get that? Sarah asked. Mrs. Jenkins gave her a sly smile. Leave that part to me. The next day in court, Sarah was more prepared than ever. She had spent the night reviewing every angle of her cross-examination strategy, and her confidence showed as she walked into the courtroom. To her surprise, Emily was nowhere to be seen. Sarah scanned the gallery, but there was no sign of her classmate. She turned to her mom, who shrugged in confusion. Maybe she's running late, her mom whispered. But as the judge entered and the proceedings began, it became clear that Emily wouldn't be testifying again. Mr. Blake didn't mention her name, and Sarah's gut told her something was off. The day's testimony centered on the traffic footage, which Mr. Blake tried to downplay. While the footage shows Miss Carter wasn't in direct contact with the victim, he argued, it doesn't prove she wasn't involved in inciting the incident. Sarah's frustration boiled over. She stood to address the court. Your Honor, she said, the prosecution's case is built entirely on speculation. The footage clearly shows I was several feet away when the victim fell. And now their key witness, Emily Brooks, is suddenly absent. Doesn't that seem suspicious? Judge Harris frowned, turning to Mr. Blake. Where is your witness, Mr. Blake? Mr. Blake hesitated. Miss Brooks informed us this morning that she wouldn't be able to testify further due to personal reasons. Sarah's heart raced. Personal reasons? Or guilt? Your Honor, she said, her voice firm. This is highly irregular. Emily's testimony is critical to the prosecution's case. If she's no longer willing to testify, that raises serious questions about the integrity of their evidence. Judge Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I'll allow the defense to make its point. But tread carefully, Miss Carter. That evening, Sarah received a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of a piece of paper, an email between Mr. Blake and Emily. The message was brief but damning. Stick to the story. It's too late to back out now. We'll take care of you if you stay consistent. Sarah stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Mrs. Jenkins had come through. But was this enough to prove Emily had been coerced? The answer would come tomorrow, in what promised to be the most explosive day of the trial yet. Sarah stared at the text on her phone, the photo of the email glowing faintly in the dim light of her bedroom. Her mind raced. This was the break she needed, but she had to be careful. If she presented it in court without solid evidence of its authenticity, the prosecution would shred her credibility. She called Mrs. Jenkins immediately. The elderly librarian picked up on the second ring, her voice calm as always. Mrs. Jenkins, I got the text, Sarah whispered, pacing her room. It's exactly what we needed, but how do I prove it's real? Mrs. Jenkins paused before responding. The sender's address and timestamps match up with Mr. Blake's official email account, but you'll need to subpoena his records to confirm it's legitimate. It's risky, but you've come this far, Sarah. Don't let fear stop you now. Sarah nodded, even though Mrs. Jenkins couldn't see her. Thank you. For everything. Just make sure you see this through. Sweetheart, Mrs. Jenkins said with a smile in her voice. The truth deserves its day in court. The next morning, Sarah walked into the courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. Her mom squeezed her hand as they took their seats. You've got this, her mom whispered. Sarah nodded, her jaw set. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the truth, no matter how hard the system tried to bury it. As the judge called the court to order, Sarah stood confidently. Your Honor, before we proceed, I have a critical piece of evidence to present, she announced. Judge Harris raised an eyebrow. This is highly unusual, Miss Carter. What evidence are you referring to? Sarah took a deep breath and held up her phone. This is a photograph of an email exchange between the prosecution and their key witness, Emily Brooks. The email suggests the witness was pressured into providing false testimony. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Mr. Blake stood abruptly. Objection. This is inadmissible. The defense cannot present evidence without verifying its authenticity. Sarah was ready for this. Your Honor, she said calmly, I'm requesting a subpoena of Mr. Blake's email records to confirm the authenticity of this document. If the email is genuine, it proves witness tampering, a direct violation of legal ethics. Judge Harris leaned back in his chair, his expression stern. Miss Carter, you realize the gravity of your accusation? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied without hesitation. But I also realized the gravity of the truth. The judge turned to Mr. Blake, who was visibly flustered. Mr. Blake, do you have a response? Your Honor, Mr. Blake began, his voice strained. This is a baseless accusation. Miss Carter is grasping at straws. Sarah didn't back down. If it's baseless, then there's no harm in verifying the records. The judge tapped his gavel, silencing the murmurs in the room. I'm granting the subpoena. Court is adjourned until we have the results. The next 48 hours were the longest of Sarah's life. She couldn't focus on school, food, or even sleep. Every minute felt like an eternity. But when the day finally arrived, she walked into the courtroom with her head held high, ready to face whatever came next. The judge began the session without delay. The court has reviewed the subpoenaed email records, he announced. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of tension. And it appears Miss Carter's claim has merit. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Mr. Blake's face turned ashen, and he immediately rose to speak. Your Honor, this is being taken out of context. The judge cut him off with a sharp glare. Mr. Blake, this court takes accusations of witness tampering very seriously. I'm suspending these proceedings pending an ethics review of the prosecution. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. The trial wasn't over, but for the first time, the scales of justice seemed to tilt in her favor. She turned to her mom, who was crying tears of relief. As the judge adjourned the court, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Emily, her eyes red and puffy. I'm so sorry, Emily whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't want to do it, but he said if I didn't lie, they'd go after my family. Sarah softened, her anger melting into empathy. It's okay, Emily. I understand. But it's over now. Emily nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Thank you for standing up to him. I wish I had your courage. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Sarah, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust toward her. Miss Carter, how does it feel to outsmart the prosecution? Do you think this case will change how young defendants are treated? What's next for you? Sarah took a deep breath, shielding her eyes from the blinding lights. This case isn't just about me, she said. It's about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. I hope it inspires others to do the same. As the crowd erupted with questions, Sarah's mom pulled her into a hug, shielding her from the chaos. You did it, her mom whispered. You really did it. But Sarah knew the fight wasn't over yet. The court might have ruled in her favor today, but the final verdict was still to come, and she was ready to face it head-on. The courtroom was silent as Sarah sat at her table, the weight of the trial's events pressing on her shoulders. The judge's decision to suspend proceedings for an ethics review was a monumental victory, but Sarah knew it wasn't the end. The prosecution would regroup, and she still had to prove her innocence beyond a shadow of a doubt. Her mom squeezed her hand. You're doing amazing, Sarah. But are you okay? This has been so much. Sarah nodded, though her mind was racing. I'm okay, Mom. I just have to stay focused. They're going to come back harder, and I need to be ready. The next day brought a new development. As Sarah arrived at the courthouse, she noticed a crowd gathered outside. Protesters were holding signs that read, "Justice for Sarah" and "Truth Matters." Others, however, carried opposing signs, "Guilty until proven innocent" and "No mercy for bullies." The sight was overwhelming. Sarah's case had become a public spectacle, and it felt like everyone had an opinion. Reporters swarmed her as she entered the courthouse. Sarah, do you think the prosecution's misconduct will lead to a mistrial? Are you confident about the ethics review? Do you think your age is helping or hurting your case? Sarah didn't answer, her mom guiding her through the throng of cameras and microphones. She felt the pressure mounting, but she reminded herself of Mrs. Jenkins's words. The truth deserves its day in court. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Mr. Blake sat at the prosecution's table, visibly shaken but composed enough to present a new motion. Your Honor, he began. While the court reviews the ethics allegations, I'd like to introduce new evidence that supports the prosecution's case. Sarah's heart sank. What now? Judge Harris glanced at him, his skepticism evident. Proceed, Mr. Blake. The prosecutor handed a folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. This is a sworn statement from another student who witnessed the incident. They claim that while Miss Carter didn't push the victim directly, she provoked the altercation. Sarah's jaw clenched. Another false witness? She glanced at the gallery, scanning the faces of her peers. Who else had been roped into this web of lies? The judge reviewed the document, then turned to Sarah. Miss Carter, do you have a response? Sarah stood, keeping her voice steady. Your Honor, I haven't had a chance to review this statement, but I request the opportunity to cross-examine this new witness. Judge Harris nodded. The court will hear from the witness tomorrow. For now, we'll adjourn. That evening, Sarah sat in her room, staring at the ceiling. Another witness. Another hurdle. She wondered if the system would ever give her a fair shot. But just as doubt began to creep in, her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Jenkins. The truth is relentless. Stay strong. Sarah smiled. The librarian's unwavering support felt like a lifeline. The next morning, the courtroom was packed as the new witness took the stand. To Sarah's shock, it was Kyle, one of the boys she barely knew but recognized from school. Kyle was a quiet kid who mostly kept to himself, so seeing him involved in this case was baffling. Mr. Blake began his questioning. Kyle, can you tell the court what you saw that day? Kyle fidgeted nervously. Yeah. I saw Sarah arguing with the victim before he fell. She was yelling at him, saying he needed to back off. Mr. Blake nodded. And did it seem like her words might have incited the altercation? Kyle hesitated, glancing at Sarah. I guess, yeah. It seemed like it. Sarah's heart sank. The testimony was vague but damaging. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached the stand cautiously. Kyle, she began, her voice calm. How long have we known each other? Not long, he replied. We don't really talk. Right. So how would you know if I had any issues with the victim before that day? Kyle looked uncomfortable. I guess I wouldn't. And you said you guessed my words incited the fight. Isn't it true that you didn't actually hear everything I said? Kyle shifted in his seat. I mean, I heard some of it, but not all of it. No. Sarah paused, letting the silence hang in the air. Then she took a step closer. Kyle, did anyone pressure you into testifying against me? His eyes darted toward Mr. Blake, who shook his head subtly. Kyle swallowed hard. No. Are you sure? Sarah pressed. Because it seems like you're not entirely certain about what you saw or heard that day. Kyle didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes. During the recess, Sarah sat alone in the hallway, replaying the cross-examination in her mind. She had planted seeds of doubt, but was it enough? As she sat there, Emily appeared, clutching a small notebook. Emily? Sarah asked, surprised. Emily handed her the notebook, her hands trembling. It's my journal, she whispered. Everything that happened. What they made me do. It's all in there. I hope it helps. Sarah opened the notebook, her eyes scanning the pages. Emily had documented everything. The pressure from Mr. Blake, the promises he made, and her guilt about lying. It was a goldmine. Emily, this is huge, Sarah said, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you. I'm sorry it took me so long, Emily said, tears in her eyes. But I couldn't keep lying. When court resumed, Sarah approached the judge with Emily's journal. Your Honor, I have new evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's case, she said. This journal details witness tampering and false testimony orchestrated by Mr. Blake. The courtroom erupted into chaos as the judge examined the journal. Mr. Blake stood, his face pale. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The judge slammed his gavel. Enough, Mr. Blake. If these allegations are true, this court will take immediate action. He turned to Sarah. Miss Carter, we'll adjourn until I've reviewed this evidence. But I'll warn you. If this is another baseless claim, there will be consequences. Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. She had taken another risk, but the truth was finally coming to light. As she walked out of the courtroom, she felt a glimmer of hope. The courtroom buzzed with tension the next morning as Judge Harris took his seat. The gallery was packed with spectators eager to see how Sarah's latest evidence would unfold. Emily's journal, now in the hands of the court, had sent shockwaves through the prosecution and left Mr. Blake visibly rattled. Sarah sat at her table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had spent the previous night poring over the journal, preparing herself for whatever came next. If the judge found the evidence credible, it could dismantle the prosecution's case entirely. But if he dismissed it, "All rise," the bailiff announced as the judge entered. The room stood in respectful silence until Judge Harris motioned for everyone to sit. "This court has reviewed the journal submitted by the defense," he began, his voice steady but charged. The entries detail troubling allegations of misconduct by the prosecution, including witness tampering and coercion. Gasps rippled through the room. Sarah could see Mr. Blake's jaw tighten, his composure fraying at the edges. The judge continued, "If these allegations are true, they undermine not only the integrity of this trial but the credibility of the entire prosecution team. Mr. Blake, do you have a response?" Blake stood, his movements stiff. "Your Honor, the defense has no concrete proof that this journal is authentic or that its contents reflect the truth. It's the word of a single witness, one who has already demonstrated unreliability." Sarah couldn't stay silent. She stood, her voice firm. "Your Honor, Emily Brooks came forward willingly, despite the risk of exposing herself to scrutiny. Her journal matches the timeline of events perfectly. If Mr. Blake disputes its authenticity, I request a handwriting analysis and a sworn affidavit from the author." Judge Harris raised an eyebrow. "A reasonable request. Mr. Blake?" The prosecutor hesitated, clearly weighing his options. "If the court deems it necessary, we'll comply," he said through gritted teeth. The proceedings were adjourned for a handwriting analysis, and Sarah felt a small wave of relief. Each delay bought her time to strengthen her case and expose the truth. As she walked out of the courthouse that day, she noticed Emily waiting for her by the steps. "Emily," Sarah said, surprised, "what are you doing here?" "I wanted to thank you," Emily said, her voice soft, "for believing me, for giving me the courage to tell the truth." Sarah smiled. "You didn't have to do this, but you did. That's what matters." Emily looked down, fiddling with the strap of her bag. "There's something else. I overheard Mr. Blake talking to Kyle before he testified. He told him what to say." Sarah's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Emily nodded. "I couldn't hear everything, but it was clear he was coaching him." Sarah's mind raced. If she could prove Blake had influenced Kyle's testimony, it would cement her case. "Emily, would you be willing to testify to what you heard?" Emily hesitated, fear flickering across her face. I'll think about it." The next morning, the results of the handwriting analysis confirmed the journal's authenticity. The judge addressed the courtroom, his tone sharp. "This evidence is compelling, and it casts a shadow over the prosecution's case. Mr. Blake, I will allow the defense to call Emily Brooks as a rebuttal witness." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was her chance. Emily took the stand nervously, her hands gripping the edge of the witness box. Sarah approached slowly, her voice calm and reassuring. "Emily, can you tell the court what you heard before Kyle's testimony?" Emily swallowed hard. "Mr. Blake was talking to Kyle. He told him to say that Sarah provoked the fight, even if he wasn't sure." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Mr. Blake shot to his feet. "Objection. Hearsay. Overruled," Judge Harris said firmly. "Continue, Miss Brooks." Emily's voice grew stronger. "Kyle didn't want to do it, but Mr. Blake said he'd make things difficult for him if he didn't cooperate." Sarah stepped closer. "Emily, why did you come forward with this now?" Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "Because it was wrong. Sarah didn't deserve this." As the session continued, the prosecution's case crumbled under the weight of Emily's testimony and the journal's revelations. Mr. Blake grew increasingly defensive, his objections more desperate and less effective. When the judge finally adjourned for the day, Sarah felt a glimmer of triumph. But as she packed up her notes, she noticed Mr. Blake glaring at her from across the room. His expression was a mixture of anger and determination, and it sent a chill down her spine. That evening, Sarah sat with her mom at the kitchen table, going over the day's events. "You're doing so well," her mom said, pride evident in her voice. "But I worry about what they'll do next. Blake doesn't seem like the type to back down." Sarah nodded. He's not.
But neither am I.
Just as she said it, a loud knock echoed through the house. Sarah and her mom exchanged a wary glance before her mom went to the door. When she opened it, 2 police officers stood on the porch. "Is Sarah Carter home?" one of them asked, his tone serious. Her mom's face paled. "Yes, but what's this about?" "We have a warrant to search the premises," the officer said, holding up a document. "We received information that may be relevant to her case." Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What information? From who?" "That's classified," the officer replied. As they entered the house, Sarah's mind raced. Was this another attempt to intimidate her? And if so, who was behind it? Sarah stood frozen as the 2 police officers stepped into her home, their authoritative presence casting a heavy shadow over the small kitchen. Her mom looked at her, panic flashing in her eyes. "What is this about?" her mom asked again, her voice trembling. "Ma'am, we're just following protocol," one officer replied. "We have reason to believe there's evidence here related to Miss Carter's case." "This won't take long." Sarah clenched her fists. "Evidence? What evidence? I've already turned over everything for the trial." The officer didn't respond, handing her mom the search warrant instead. Her mom scanned it quickly, her hands shaking, then handed it to Sarah. The warrant was vague, citing an anonymous tip that claimed Sarah had been hiding incriminating materials. It didn't specify what they were looking for, only that they had the legal authority to search. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said, her voice rising. "This is just another way to intimidate me." The officers didn't reply. They began searching the house methodically, opening drawers, rifling through cabinets, and even checking inside Sarah's school bag. Every sound, the opening of a cupboard, the flipping of pages, felt like a violation. Sarah's mom placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We have nothing to hide," she said softly. "Let them look." But Sarah wasn't so sure. This wasn't about finding evidence. It was about sending a message. Someone wanted to rattle her, and they were doing a good job of it. The search lasted nearly an hour. The officers didn't find anything, but they left with a stern warning. "If anything else comes to light, we'll be back," one of them said before closing the door behind him. As soon as they were gone, Sarah collapsed into a chair, her head in her hands. "They're trying to scare me," she said, her voice muffled. "They know they're losing, so they're pulling every dirty trick they can." Her mom sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Let them try. You've stood up to worse than this, Sarah." Sarah nodded, but her resolve felt shakier than before. She had fought so hard to uncover the truth, but it seemed like the closer she got, the more the system pushed back. The next day in court, Sarah noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Mr. Blake was more subdued, his usual sharp confidence dulled. The judge called the session to order, and Sarah steeled herself for whatever was coming next. "Miss Carter," Judge Harris began, "before we proceed with today's testimony, the court needs to address the incident at your home last night. I was informed that a search warrant was executed. Do you have anything to say about this?" Sarah rose, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Your Honor, the search was based on an anonymous tip with no merit. The officers found nothing because there was nothing to find. This was a blatant attempt to intimidate me." Judge Harris's expression darkened. He turned to Mr. Blake. "Mr. Blake, do you have any knowledge of this tip?" Blake hesitated. "No, Your Honor. The prosecution was not involved." Sarah could see the slight twitch in his jaw and knew he was lying. But without proof, she couldn't accuse him outright. "Very well," the judge said, his tone sharp. "Let's proceed. Miss Carter, you may call your next witness." Sarah called Mrs. Jenkins to the stand. The librarian's calm demeanor and articulate responses gave Sarah a boost of confidence as she guided her testimony. "Mrs. Jenkins," Sarah began, "can you describe your role in helping me prepare for this case?" Mrs. Jenkins smiled warmly. "Of course." Sarah came to the library frequently to research legal precedents, study court procedures, and prepare her arguments. I provided her with resources and guidance, but all the hard work was her own. "And did you ever witness me attempting to fabricate evidence or hide anything related to this case?" "Absolutely not," Mrs. Jenkins said firmly. Sarah has been nothing but honest and determined to uncover the truth. Sarah glanced at the judge, who was listening intently. She pressed on. Mrs. Jenkins, based on what you've observed, do you believe I've been treated fairly during this trial? Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I believe Sarah has faced unnecessary obstacles. She's had to work harder than most to be taken seriously, but she's never let that stop her. As Mrs. Jenkins stepped down, Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope. The judge called for a recess, and Sarah used the time to review her notes. But as she sat at her table, a man in a dark suit approached her. You're Sarah Carter, right? He said, his voice low. Sarah nodded warily. Who's asking? The man handed her a business card. I'm James Carter, no relation. I'm an investigator with the state's attorney's office. I've been looking into the allegations against Mr. Blake. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. And James leaned in, lowering his voice further. Let's just say this isn't the first time he's been accused of misconduct, but proving it has been difficult. I've been following your case, and I think you might have what we need to finally hold him accountable. Sarah stared at him, her mind racing. Was this the breakthrough she'd been waiting for, or just another risk that could backfire? What do you need from me? She asked. Keep doing what you're doing, James said. Every time he slips up, it strengthens the case against him. And if you find anything else, call me. He tapped the business card on the table and walked away, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but Sarah couldn't stop thinking about James's words. If Mr. Blake was corrupt, taking him down could expose the rot in the system and finally give her a fair chance. But it also meant putting herself in even greater danger. That night, as Sarah sat in her room, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Be careful who you trust. Not everyone wants you to win. Sarah stared at the screen, a chill running down her spine. Someone was watching her. But who? And how far were they willing to go to stop her? Sarah stared at the ominous text on her phone, her hands trembling slightly. She felt the walls closing in, the invisible presence of those who wanted her to fail pressing down on her. Who could have sent the message? Mr. Blake? Someone working with him? Or was it a scare tactic meant to throw her off balance? Her mom entered the room, noticing her pale face. Sarah, what's wrong? She asked, her voice full of concern. Sarah hesitated, then handed her the phone. Her mom's eyes narrowed as she read the message. This has gone too far, her mom said, her voice rising with anger. We need to tell someone. Sarah shook her head. Mom, we don't even know who sent it. And if we tell the wrong person, it might just make things worse. Her mom sighed, sitting down beside her. You can't fight this alone, Sarah. You've already taken on so much. I know, Sarah said, her voice firm, but I'm not going to stop now. I'm so close. I can feel it. The next day in court, Sarah arrived with a renewed sense of purpose. She refused to let fear dictate her actions. The gallery was packed, and the tension in the room was palpable as Judge Harris called the session to order. Miss Carter, are you prepared to proceed with your case? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah said confidently. Then call your next witness. Sarah stood, her heart pounding as she glanced at her notes. She had debated her strategy all night and decided to take a calculated risk. I'd like to call Mr. Kyle Richards to the stand, she announced. Kyle, the boy who had testified against her earlier, looked startled as he was summoned. He hesitated, glancing nervously at Mr. Blake, before making his way to the witness box. The unease in his body language was evident. Once he was sworn in, Sarah approached, her tone calm but probing. Kyle, you testified earlier that you heard me arguing with the victim before the incident, correct? Kyle nodded, avoiding her gaze. Yeah. And you said my words might have incited the altercation? Yeah, that's what I said. Sarah paced slowly, her voice steady. Kyle, can you explain why your testimony didn't match the traffic footage that clearly showed me standing several feet away from the victim at the time? Kyle fidgeted, his face reddening. I don't know. Maybe I didn't see everything. Or maybe, Sarah said, her tone sharpening, someone told you what to say. Mr. Blake stood abruptly. Objection. Speculation. Overruled, Judge Harris said, his gaze fixed on Kyle. "Answer the question, Mr. Richards." Kyle's eyes darted around the room. I just wanted to help," he mumbled. "Help who?" Sarah pressed. "The prosecution?" Mr. Blake's face darkened. "Objection. This is badgering the witness." "Sustained," the judge said. "Miss Carter, rephrase your question." Sarah took a deep breath, calming herself. "Kyle, did anyone influence your testimony? You're under oath, and this is your chance to tell the truth." Kyle hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the witness box. The room was silent, all eyes on him. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "Yes," he admitted. "Mr. Blake told me what to say." The courtroom exploded into murmurs, the revelation sending shockwaves through the gallery. Judge Harris banged his gavel, calling for order. "Mr. Richards," the judge said sternly, "are you saying the prosecution coached you to give false testimony?" Kyle nodded miserably. "He said I wouldn't get in trouble if I just stuck to the story." Sarah felt a surge of vindication, but she knew the battle wasn't over. Mr. Blake stood, his face a mask of barely concealed rage. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he said, his voice tight. "This witness is clearly unreliable. The defense has manipulated him." "Enough," Judge Harris interrupted. "Mr. Blake, these are serious allegations. I'll be filing an immediate motion to investigate your conduct in this case." Sarah watched as Mr. Blake's composure cracked. He opened his mouth to protest, but the judge silenced him with a glare. "Court is adjourned for today," Judge Harris declared, slamming his gavel. "And Mr. Blake, I suggest you prepare for a very thorough review of your actions." As Sarah stepped out of the courthouse, she was met with a sea of reporters shouting questions. "Sarah, how do you feel about today's testimony? Do you think the prosecution's case is falling apart? Will you pursue legal action against Mr. Blake?" Sarah ignored the questions, focusing instead on her mom, who stood waiting with open arms. "You did it," her mom said, tears in her eyes. "You proved they were lying." Sarah smiled weakly. "It's not over yet."
But it's a start.
That evening, Sarah received another text from the unknown number. "You're making enemies, Sarah. Be careful." Her chest tightened as she read the words. Whoever was behind the messages wasn't giving up. But instead of fear, Sarah felt a spark of determination ignite within her. "They can try to scare me," she said to herself, "but I'm not stopping until the truth comes out." The courtroom was buzzing louder than ever. After Kyle's confession about Mr. Blake coaching his testimony, the case had shifted dramatically in Sarah's favor. The prosecution was in damage control mode, scrambling to salvage their case while facing mounting allegations of misconduct. Sarah arrived early, her backpack stuffed with notes and legal documents. She had barely slept, her mind churning with strategies for the days ahead. The text messages still lingered in the back of her mind, but she pushed them aside. Fear would only distract her from what mattered, winning this case. As the judge entered and the court was called to order, Sarah noticed Mr. Blake's usually confident demeanor had wilted. His tie was crooked, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. "Miss Carter," Judge Harris said, addressing her directly, "this court commends your resilience and diligence. However, the recent revelations require us to determine whether this trial can continue in its current state. The allegations against Mr. Blake are serious, and the integrity of this case is under review." Sarah nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'd like to proceed today with my final arguments, if the court permits." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're aware the prosecution has not formally withdrawn their case?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said confidently. "But I believe my final arguments will demonstrate the truth clearly enough to end this trial." Sarah stood and addressed the court, her voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this trial has been about more than a single incident. It's been about fairness, about integrity, and about what happens when those in power abuse the trust we place in them." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. "From the beginning, I've maintained my innocence, and I've worked tirelessly to prove it. We've seen footage that exonerates me, heard testimony that reveals coercion, and uncovered unethical actions by the prosecution. This isn't justice, It's manipulation. Sarah turned to the jury, locking eyes with each member. But justice isn't about who can shout the loudest or intimidate the most. It's about the truth. And the truth is, I didn't push that boy. I didn't provoke him. I was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. She gestured toward the prosecution's table. The system tried to paint me as a villain, but the facts don't lie. And when those facts didn't support their case, they resorted to deceit. But you, the jury, have the power to put an end to this, to show that the truth still matters. When Sarah finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Judge Harris looked impressed, his usual stern expression softening slightly. "Does the prosecution have a rebuttal?" the judge asked. Mr. Blake stood, his face pale. "Your Honor, in light of recent developments, the prosecution requests a recess to re-evaluate our position." Judge Harris frowned. "You've had ample time to prepare, Mr. Blake." "Denied. Proceed with your rebuttal." Blake hesitated, clearly floundering. "Your Honor, we have no further arguments." The gallery erupted into whispers. Sarah's heart raced as the judge banged his gavel. "Order!" Judge Harris barked. He turned to the jury. "You have heard the arguments and reviewed the evidence. The case is now in your hands. Court is adjourned until the jury reaches a verdict." The wait was agonizing. Hours passed as the jury deliberated. Sarah sat in the courthouse hallway with her mom, clutching her hands tightly. "You were amazing in there," her mom said, though her voice betrayed her anxiety. "No one could have done what you just did." "Thanks, Mom," Sarah said quietly.
But it's not over yet.
Finally, the bailiff appeared, his expression unreadable. "The jury has reached a verdict," he announced. Sarah's stomach churned as she returned to the courtroom. The air was thick with tension as everyone took their seats. The jury filed in, their faces somber, and the forepersons stood. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" Judge Harris asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, holding a folded piece of paper. The judge unfolded the paper, his expression giving nothing away as he read. Finally, he looked up, his voice firm. "In the case of the People versus Sarah Carter, the jury finds the defendant not guilty." The words hit Sarah like a wave of relief. She heard her mom gasp beside her, and tears sprang to her eyes as the courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Harris banged his gavel, silencing the room. "Order. Miss Carter, you are free to go." "This court is adjourned." Sarah stood, her legs trembling as she turned to her mom, who pulled her into a tight embrace. "You did it," her mom whispered, her voice breaking. "You proved them wrong." As Sarah left the courthouse, reporters swarmed her once again, their questions blending into an unintelligible blur. But this time, she held her head high, a small smile on her face. Later that evening, Sarah sat on her bed, staring at her phone. She had won the trial, cleared her name, and exposed corruption in the process. But as she scrolled through her messages, she saw one that sent a chill down her spine. "You may have won this battle, but it's not over." Sarah's hands clenched around her phone. She wasn't sure who was behind the threats or what they planned to do next. But one thing was certain, she wasn't done fighting. Sarah stared at the cryptic text message, her heart racing. The trial was over, but the looming threat felt more real than ever. Who was sending these messages? And what did they mean by "it's not over"? Her mom walked into her room, her face lighting up when she saw Sarah. "The neighbors just dropped off cookies," she said, holding up a plate. "They're so proud of you." Sarah forced a smile.
"That's nice of them."
But her mom's expression shifted as she noticed Sarah's tense posture. "What's wrong?" Sarah hesitated before showing her the message. Her mom's face darkened as she read it. "This has to stop," her mom said firmly. "We should report this to the police." "And say what?" Sarah replied, her voice shaking. "That I'm getting anonymous threats? They'll just say it's nothing unless something happens." Her mom sat beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, you've been so brave through all of this, but you can't face everything alone. Promise me you'll tell someone if this escalates." Sarah nodded, though a knot of unease tightened in her chest. She didn't want to worry her mom more than she already had. The next day, Sarah decided to visit Mrs. Jenkins at the library. The librarian greeted her warmly, her eyes crinkling with pride. "Sarah, my dear, the whole town's talking about you," Mrs. Jenkins said. "You've inspired so many people." Sarah smiled. "Thanks, Mrs. Jenkins. I couldn't have done it without your help." "Don't sell yourself short," the librarian replied, her voice soft but firm. "You stood up for yourself in a way most adults wouldn't dare." As they spoke, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced around the library, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the unease lingered. "Everything okay?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, noticing her distracted expression. Sarah hesitated. "I've been getting these weird messages. Someone's trying to scare me." Mrs. Jenkins's brow furrowed. "Have you told anyone?" "My mom knows, but I don't think there's much we can do," Sarah said. "They're anonymous." Mrs. Jenkins leaned in closer. "Whoever it is, they're trying to rattle you. Don't let them win. If you need help, I'm here." As Sarah left the library, her phone buzzed again. She froze, dreading what she might see this time. The message was short but chilling. "We're watching. Don't get comfortable." Sarah's hands trembled as she scanned the street. It was a quiet afternoon, but every parked car and every stranger walking by now felt like a potential threat. That evening, Sarah sat in her room, combing through her trial notes and the documents she had collected during the case. She was searching for any loose end she might have missed, anything that could explain who was targeting her. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, the message was accompanied by a photo. It showed her leaving the courthouse the day of the verdict, her mom by her side. The caption read, "You're not untouchable." Fear gripped her, but anger quickly followed. Whoever was behind this wanted her to be scared. They wanted her to feel powerless. But Sarah refused to give them that satisfaction. She picked up her phone and dialed the number James Carter, the investigator, had given her. "James," she said when he answered, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I think someone's trying to intimidate me." The next morning, James met Sarah and her mom at a local cafe. He listened carefully as Sarah described the messages and showed him the photos. "This isn't random," James said, his tone serious. "Whoever is doing this knows exactly how to push your buttons. Do you think it's connected to the trial?" Sarah asked. James nodded. "Most likely. The people you expose during the case don't just disappear quietly. They might see you as a threat." Sarah's mom looked alarmed. "What can we do?" "I'll look into it," James said. "In the meantime, Sarah, keep a record of every message, every strange interaction. And if you notice anyone following you, call me immediately." Over the next few days, the messages continued, each one more unsettling than the last. "You've made enemies. Justice isn't always fair. Be careful who you trust." But Sarah stayed vigilant, documenting everything and forwarding it to James. She also made a point of sticking to public places and staying close to her mom or friends whenever possible. One evening, while reviewing her notes yet again, Sarah noticed something she had overlooked before. A name mentioned briefly in the court records, someone who had worked with Mr. Blake on several cases. The name was Greg Weston, a private investigator known for using underhanded tactics to discredit defendants. Sarah's pulse quickened as she connected the dots. Was Weston the one behind the threats? And if so, what was he planning? Determined to find answers, Sarah shared her discovery with James the next day. He frowned as he looked over the documents she had highlighted. "Weston's a known player in cases like this," James said. "If he's involved, we need to be careful. He's good at staying just within the boundaries of the law." Sarah's stomach churned. "What do we do?" James smiled faintly. "We turn the tables. If Weston's watching you, we'll watch him." That night, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. With James's help, she had a plan. But as she lay in bed, staring at her phone, another message came through. "Think you're safe? Think again." Sarah's breath caught. Whoever was behind this wasn't giving up, but neither was she. The days following the latest threat were a whirlwind. James Carter, true to his word, had begun tracking Greg Weston, piecing together the extent of his involvement. Sarah's fear was ever present, but it fueled her determination. She wasn't going to back down, not after coming this far. One afternoon, James called Sarah with an update. Weston's definitely involved, he said, his tone grim. I've intercepted communication between him and someone higher up, possibly someone connected to the DA's office. It seems like they're trying to silence you, Sarah. Silence me? Sarah repeated, her stomach twisting. Why? The trial's over. They're afraid of what you represent, James explained. You exposed corruption, Sarah. People like Weston thrive in a system that hides the truth. You're a threat to that system. That evening, James laid out a plan. They would gather concrete evidence of Weston's involvement, but it required bait, Sarah herself. The idea terrified her, but she agreed. I'm tired of running, she said. If this is the only way to stop them, I'll do it. James set up a meeting at a local diner, a public place where Sarah could confront Weston under controlled circumstances. He would be nearby, along with other investigators, ready to step in if things got dangerous. The diner was bustling when Sarah arrived, the clatter of dishes and hum of conversation masking her nerves. Weston was already there, seated in a corner booth, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Sarah took a deep breath and walked over, her head held high. Mr. Weston? She said, her voice steady. He looked up, feigning surprise. Miss Carter, to what do I owe the pleasure? Sarah slid into the booth, her gaze unwavering. I know you've been following me, sending threats, trying to scare me. Weston smirked. You've got quite the imagination. Sarah leaned forward. You might be able to hide behind anonymity, but people like you always slip up. I've already turned your name over to investigators. For a split second, Weston's smug facade faltered. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Sarah replied, her confidence growing. You're part of a system that thrives on fear and lies. But guess what? People are watching now. The whole town knows my story. If something happens to me, you won't get away with it. Weston's jaw tightened. You should be careful, Miss Carter. Sometimes the truth can be dangerous. Not as dangerous as lies, Sarah shot back. Before Weston could respond, James appeared, flanked by two other investigators. Greg Weston, James said, his voice loud enough to draw attention. You're under investigation for harassment, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. Weston froze, his eyes darting toward the door, but James blocked his escape. I'd suggest cooperating. It'll look better for you. The aftermath of Weston's arrest sent ripples through the town. As more details emerged, it became clear that Weston had been working with a network of corrupt officials, including Mr. Blake. Their goal had been to intimidate witnesses and defendants to secure convictions at any cost. The revelation sparked outrage, and the DA's office launched a full investigation into the practices of those involved. Mr. Blake was disbarred, and Weston faced criminal charges. Sarah's case became a symbol of resilience and the power of standing up to injustice. Months later, Sarah stood on the steps of the courthouse, addressing a crowd of reporters and supporters. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice strong and clear. It's about every person who's been silenced by fear or corruption. Justice isn't a privilege, it's a right, and we all have to fight for it. The crowd erupted into applause, but Sarah didn't linger in the spotlight. She stepped down and joined her mom, who wrapped her in a warm hug. I'm so proud of you, her mom said, tears in her eyes. Thanks, Mom, Sarah said, smiling. But I couldn't have done it without you. As they walked away, Sarah felt lighter than she had in months. The fight had been long and grueling, but she had emerged stronger, proving that even one voice could make a difference. For the first time, she felt free. The threats, the trial, the fear, it was all behind her now. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure. She would never stop standing up for what was right.